Welcome back, everyone. Our session on illegal charters will be covered by international law firm HFW. Please welcome our speakers. He's Gordon Gardner, partner at HFW, and James Jordan, senior associate at HFW. Gordon is based in Hong Kong, and James is joining us from Singapore. Gordon and James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and good afternoon, everybody. Just by way of brief introduction, for those who are not familiar with HFW, we are a sector-focused law firm. And so in aerospace, which is one of those sectors, we have a global team, excuse me, of more than about 80 lawyers who specialize in aviation, with about 30 or so lawyers just in the Asia-Pacific region. Many of you will know my colleague, James Jordan, as he heads, he's one of the co-heads of the Singapore chapter of AsBAA. And as Anthony said, I'm based in Hong Kong. Our topic for discussion today is the subject of illegal charters. Now, as many of you will be aware, it's quite a hot topic which often comes up. It's been the subject of various panel sessions in recent months. We had the Asian Sky Charter report in August, which addressed it, as well as a number of other publications. And that's great, because education and awareness is really one of the key ways to combat illegal charter. One of the interesting things about illegal charter at the moment is whether it will get worse as a result of COVID. So on the one hand, you have operators under financial pressure, and owners looking to make money from idle aircraft. And then on the other hand, you have a number of, well, potentially you have a number of new customers who may be attracted to business aviation due to reductions in commercial airline schedules and also COVID-related health concerns. People often talk about the 3 C's in the context of illegal charter: the clueless, the careless, and the criminal. The clueless, well, they don't know the rules. The careless, they don't bother checking the rules, or they just simply put their head in the sand. And then the criminal, they're the guys who deliberately ignore the rules. So in a seminar like this, essentially, we are preaching to the converted, if you like. You know, as we'll see, one of the best ways to combat illegal charter is to educate the clueless and the careless. And I'm not sure there are going to be many of those people on this, participating in this seminar. But what are we actually going to talk about today? Well, as you can see from the slide, we will begin by talking about what are illegal charters. And we'll look at a couple of recent high-profile examples of that. Then we'll go on to consider how common illegal charters are. Now, as many of you would have seen in the last couple of weeks, we've conducted a survey in conjunction with AsBAA on illegal charter activity in Asia. There's been a lot of anecdotal evidence of that activity, but up till now, the position has been really quite opaque. And so what this survey demonstrates is the extent to which people perceive illegal charter activity to be occurring across the Asian region. After we've gone through the results, what does it matter? Why bother about it? Well, we'll run through some of the issues for charter customers and also the issues for owners, operators, and managers. And then we will just flag 1 or 2 points about how you spot illegal charters and conclude by setting out 5 specific action points which we believe should be taken in order to reduce the prevalence of illegal charter in Asia. So let's start at the beginning. What is illegal charter? Well, the detail of the regulations are quite complicated and there are a number of exceptions, but the basic principle is the one set out on the slide, and that is that if an aircraft is operated privately, i.e. it's a Part 91 aircraft, it should not be used for flights for hire or reward or for valuable consideration. So in other words, if a passenger pays to fly on board an aircraft, unless an exception applies, it's public transport and the operator needs an AOC or a Part 135 certificate. Now, as I've said, there are a number of exceptions to these rules, and that's where the grey areas, where the loopholes start coming into play. And some of those are set out on the slide, and we'll look at some of these a little bit more when we come to examine the results of the survey. But for example, cost sharing. Well, yes, you can share the costs of a flight, so fuel, rental, airport charges, but you can't share the fixed costs. And then what happens if you pay a little bit more than the cost of the flight? There's cost plus. Well, that's when you start getting into the territory of illegal charter. What we've seen over the last year or two is the emergence of these cost sharing apps. Now, they have the potential to blur the boundary again between legal and illegal charter. So, for example, you may have private pilots advertising on a website to carry passengers, and they charge the cost of the flight. But what happens if they charge a little bit more than the cost of the flight? Does it then become a commercial enterprise and therefore illegal? So you can see where the boundaries start to get a little bit grey. Similarly, with flight training, is there notional instruction from an instructor? Is it actually a sales demonstration flight? These are recognised exceptions, but in reality, are they actually taking place as they're said to take place? Similarly, there's another exception which applies to payments to charities. So those are some of the exceptions, some of the examples. I spoke a little bit earlier on about the 3 C's, so the clueless, the careless, and the criminal. Another way that sometimes people look at this is to look at deliberate breaches and inadvertent breaches. A couple of examples of deliberate breaches are set out on the slide. So, for example, using aircraft which are not on the AOC is clearly going to be in breach of the regulations. Similarly, if you use crew who are not qualified to fly the aircraft. Inadvertent breaches, can and do happen. And one example, again, is set out on the slide. So, for example, where you have a flight department company, where a business sets up a special purpose vehicle to operate a Part 91 aircraft in order to ring fence the liabilities associated with the operation of that aircraft. Now, the problem comes where that SPV, that special company, has operational control and receives funding from the parent company. That may well be treated as a commercial operation and therefore require a Part 135 certificate. Those are some of the aviation regulations, but besides those regulations, charters can also be illegal in a different and more obvious sense. So clearly the carriage of drugs, for example, is going to be illegal. You may recall there was an example a number of years ago where a French owner rented out his aircraft and it was used to smuggle £40 million worth of cocaine from the Caribbean. Other examples include circumventing the immigration requirements or facilitating immoral purposes such as prostitution or human trafficking. So that's really the background. Now, I've spoken about illegal charter. What's the difference between illegal and grey charter? Well, it's that grey area around the edges. Ideally, flights would either be legal or illegal with nothing in between. But because of these exceptions, because of the various loopholes that there might be, then the position is not always particularly clear-cut. And you also have to look at the position adopted by the regulators. We'll come on to see how people responding to the survey treated the regulators in a moment, what they thought about the regulators, and it's quite interesting. But there are examples where the regulators either don't understand the issue or they take a slightly different approach. So, for example, one instance we're aware of was where a casino was carrying gamblers to gamble at the casino. Now, is that commercial transport? One regulator thought that it wasn't if there was no obligation to gamble, but another regulator took a slightly different view and they said, well, if there was an expectation that these gamblers would gamble, then it probably was commercial transport. So you can see that there's a potential for different regulators to take different views. Other regulators simply don't care, or they turn a blind eye. You know, do they do anything? Do they have the resources to do anything? And, you know, do they want to investigate? The lack of resources was a previous reason given by the Hong Kong CAD for not really investigating and checking up on illegal charter activities in Hong Kong by doing ramp checks. Next slide, please, James. So that's the background. I'm now going to hand across to James, who will talk to you about one or two specific examples which have arisen over recent months.
Thanks, Gordon. So I'm just going to look at a couple of real life examples from the last year or two, which have been widely publicized. And they're two very different types of illegal charters. The first case study that we'll look at is the classic illegal charter that Gordon mentioned, where it's someone who isn't properly licensed, doesn't have the requisite Part 135 or AOC to perform commercial operations, but is doing so for remuneration nevertheless. And the second one is a form of charter, legal charter in the truest sense, as in there was a legal activity going on throughout the charter process. So the first case study that we'll look at is the Emiliano Sala case, the case where Emiliano Sala, the football player, tragically lost his life along with the pilot of the aircraft. This case really brought illegal charter into the kind of public forum and into the limelight. Because of the individual involved, it received a lot of media attention. It was carried by all of the major newspapers, quite often on the front page in the UK, and the sports sections ran with the story for quite a significant period of time. And it's the first time I can really recall illegal charters achieving that, receiving that level of attention in the mainstream media. For those of you who aren't familiar with this accident, there was a fatal crash in January 2019 involving a Piper Malibu that was carrying an EPL football player, Emilio Sana, from Nantes to Cardiff. He'd just been signed by Cardiff City Football Club, so he was travelling to Wales to finalise his contractual arrangements to sign for that club. Cardiff, incidentally, had paid £15 million or were due to pay £15 million for Mr. Sala's services. An individual named Mr. Henderson arranged the flight for Emiliano Sala, and it subsequently transpired during the accident investigation process that neither the pilot nor the aircraft had the required licenses or permissions to operate commercially. It became very clear during the accident investigation that the pilot had agreed to receive a fee, despite only holding an FAA private pilot's license. And the accident report is fairly damning when you look at it and you look at the impact that this illegal charter actually had. On top of all of this, the night rating for the pilot license had expired, so he shouldn't have been flying the aircraft, notwithstanding the fact that it was he held a private pilot's license. He shouldn't have been flying at night, and he shouldn't have been flying in poor weather. The accident report found that the aircraft didn't meet the requisite maintenance standards. There was an issue with the autopilot and flight director, which had an intermittent fault and should have been deemed inoperative. There was also an issue with the maintenance on the exhaust pipe of the aircraft, which led to carbon monoxide, possible carbon monoxide poisoning of both the pilot and the passenger. And so this all came out during the accident investigation process. And what's really tragic here is there is an illegal charter, and illegal charters can occur for a number of reasons. Sometimes people charter aircraft because they may not have the finances to conduct a legitimate charter. But in this case, you had two very high-profile football clubs playing in the top leagues in their respective countries. you had a significant transfer fee, as I mentioned, for the footballer, which was around £15 million. And yet when it came to actually arranging his transport to from France to the UK, an illegal charter was engaged, probably on the basis of price. And this tragedy could really have been averted if someone had contacted a legitimate operator and engaged someone who was familiar with commercial operations and held a Part 135 certificate. So this really shows, like, this is a great case study, and for those who want to know more about it, I would advise looking at the accident report, because it really shows what can go wrong in an illegal charter scenario did go wrong in this situation. There was failings on the part of the pilot, there was failings in relation to the maintenance, there was a failure in relation to the flight planning. What went wrong did go wrong. And it's safe to say that the reason that this all happened was because it was an illegal charter. Sometimes illegal charters happen and they go without there being any incidents or without any accidents. But when something like this happens, it really has a detrimental impact on the entire industry, and kind of brings back the idea and the impact that, you know, some operators or some entities within the aviation industry, especially within the private aviation industry, aren't following the rules, the regulations and the guidelines, which simply isn't true. But these types of cases really bring that idea and that impression into the public mind. The second case study is an illegal charter in a different sense, as in its illegality because there was a pure illegal act which occurred during the charter process, rather than it being a situation and a scenario whereby there was a private pilot or a Part 91 holder performing commercial operations. Again, everyone will be familiar with the Carlos Ghosn case. He was the former CEO of Nissan Motors, who was accused of embezzling millions of dollars from Nissan. He subsequently escaped Japan while he was under investigation when his associates engaged the services of MNG Jet and leased two separate private jets, one which went from Dubai to Osaka and subsequently Osaka to Istanbul. In Istanbul, Mr. Ghosn and his associates switched onto another private jet, also leased and operated from MNG Jet, and that traveled from Istanbul to Beirut. There's lots of speculation, and investigations are still ongoing as to how Mr. Ghosn evaded customs in Japan, but the suggestion is that he smuggled himself through Osaka customs in a box designed for carrying musical instruments, which was then placed on board the aircraft. The reason we mention this case is because when you start digging down into the details, what becomes apparent is not just that this was a very daring attempt by Carlos Ghosn and his associates, but also that there was a real failure on the part of those involved in arranging the charter, in conducting due diligence on the people who were involved in chartering the aircraft, the Dubai entity, and then examining what the contractual relationships were. Could it have been stopped? Could it have been prevented? As I mentioned, it was a daring attempt, but had better training, better procedures been in place, there is a possibility that this Mr. Ghosn would never have got to the stage where he escapes and managed to get himself all the way to Lebanon, where he's a citizen and can evade justice from the Japanese authorities. It became clear that MNG Jet didn't really have oversight over who was operating their aircraft and the purposes that they, over who was leasing their aircraft and using their aircraft and for what purposes. It's alleged in some of the investigation papers that a senior individual at MNG Jet was involved in assisting to falsify certain documentation, and so that Carlos Ghosn didn't show as a passenger on the flight manifest. And MNG Jet claimed that they were equally a victim of this illegal activity. If that's taken at face value and accepted, the kind of real sad thing about this case is that a number of MNG employees, including the flight crew and cabin crew, have become subject of criminal investigations and criminal sanctions, even though their culpability and knowledge of what actually occurred or was going to occur is less than apparent. And so all of these individuals, and I think there's a 7 or 8 M&G employees ranging from rather junior employees within the organization to rather senior ones, are all facing charges. And it's unclear at this stage to what extent they knew about the illegal activity that was going on during this operation. But again, as I mentioned, with training, procedures, and a proper due diligence over what's actually going to be done with the aircraft when it is leased out or when people are using the aircraft, potentially this could have been prevented. And so one of the things which is really difficult when we come to talk about illegal charters is really finding facts and figures about the prevalence in the industry. As many of you all know, when you engage with regulators, you can tell them about a problem or a perceived problem or a potential problem, but they're only really normally interested in engaging when either an accident or incident happens, or if you have hard data that you can present to them and say, this is the problem, this is the percentage of flights which are illegal, this is the cost to the market. That's difficult to do with a legal charter. There's been a number of attempts to gather information. In the US, there's been some attempts at surveys. NATO conducted a survey, and we'll compare that with our own survey that we've conducted. But the real problem here is really identifying the prevalence in the industry. But our survey, which Gordon is going to talk about, and we'll talk about in a moment, really starts to highlight what people believe and the perceptions of illegal charter in the APAC region. Over to you, Gordon.
Thanks, James. Well, as James has explained, I mean, the purpose of this survey is really to sort of drill down and get some data on what people think is going on in the Asian region. Obviously, it slightly depends on where the respondents to the survey are located, because they're more likely to know the situation where they're based, as opposed to, you know, in a country some way away. What we've done in response to certain of the questions is compared the position in Asia to the position that emerged in the US as a result of the NATO survey, which was conducted, I think, in August or September last year. And I presented the results of that NATO survey to the Hong Kong Safety Day last year. So let's carry on. Let's have a look at the survey results and see what the conclusions are. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through a number of the questions which we asked and just draw out 1 or 2 points which emerge from that. So the first point was, you know, what are the perceived hotspots of illegal charter activity in Asia? Well, as you can see from the map, if you look at Greater China as a whole, then that is the #1 hotspot. It's more prevalent on the mainland than it is in Hong Kong. However, if you split out the mainland, Hong Kong and Taiwan, then actually Malaysia comes out as the #1 in the #1 spot. And then it's closely followed by Indonesia and Thailand. So those are the top 5 countries, if you like, where illegal charter activity is perceived to be happening. Let's have a look at the next question, James, please. This is a really interesting result. You know, within the Asian Pacific region, what proportion of charter flights do you think are illegal? Now, the blue section represents those who believe that more than 30% of charter flights are illegal. And as you can see, nearly half the respondents thought that that was the case. And you can, if you add on the green section as well, over 70% of respondents think that more than 20% of charter flights are illegal. Now, just to put this into context, if you look at the average number of charter flights in 2019, so last year, my understanding is that it was about 130 charter flights per day across the Asia Pacific region. Now, if you take 30% of that, then in theory, if the maths is right, then that's about 40 charter flights per day that people think are actually illegal, which is a pretty astonishing number of flights. So that's the response to that question. Let's move forwards. Dealing briefly with the nature of the respondents, does your company hold a Part 135 certificate? More than half of the respondents did work for a company with such a certificate. So, I think the point to be made here is that clearly people who hold a Part 135 certificate are going to have the most robust views in relation to a legal charter, because it's the people doing a legal charter who are damaging their business. And that's when we come on to the next slide. This compares the position between the US, which is shown in orange, and the position in Asia, which is shown in green. Has your business been negatively impacted by competition from illegal charter operations? As you can see, in the US last year, 9 out of 10 respondents said yes. In Asia, 7 out of 10 respondents said yes. That's probably understandable in the sense that the market in the US is much bigger and it's more mature. What's interesting, however, is when you get to the next slide. Did you report the illegal charter activity to the local regulator? In the US, it's about 50-50. But what's astonishing about this slide is that 84% of people in Asia did not report the illegal charter activity to the local regulator. Now, there are a host of different reasons for that, but some of the reasons are set out in response to the next question. So if you look at the orange segment and the green segment, those are essentially the people who are worried about reputation, wanting to avoid a reputation as reporting on others, and it's a small community and reporting could adversely affect my company. And that's well over half of the respondents citing that as a barrier to reporting a legal charter. Similarly, you have about a quarter of respondents who are unsure how the authorities will respond. And what that shows is that there needs to be greater regulatory clarity as to how matters should be reported and what action is going to be taken by the regulator. And it's interesting, in the comments in response to this question, people cited quite often the fact that they didn't know how to report to the local regulator. There was no mechanism. And so that's one of the sort of the key sort of actions to be taken from this, I think. James, I'll let you deal with the other half of the survey.
Thanks, Gordon. So, and the next question we asked was, what examples of illegal charter activity have you seen? And so by far the most common was flights advertised at prices far below legitimate operations, with 35.8% of respondents saying that that was one example of illegal charter activity they'd seen. Another 26.4% stated that there were flights claiming to operate as cost sharing, and as Gordon touched on at the beginning of the session, cost sharing is something which is permitted under Part 91. Although there are, quite strict requirements for cost sharing. There's a good example of regulatory enforcement in the US and a recent enforcement action where it was basically 100% cost sharing. So the operator was requiring the passengers, the users of the aircraft, to pay 100% of the cost, but there was no profit or markup. They said that this was permitted under the Part 91 license. But the FAA said no, that is a commercial flight, commercial operation. So cost sharing, as Gordon mentioned, does have some stipulations, and it has to be truly a cost sharing arrangement. And then another 20.8% said they'd seen flights being sold as sales demos or flight training. Amongst there was many other examples where they were cited under the other section, and that was owners demanding that persons that were friends paid money, or transactions going on behind closed doors. Just other examples where there were no certificates or licenses in place, or consortiums and businesses charging different group structures for flights, and essentially that made it a commercial operation even though there was no commercial license in place. And so again, connected to that, how did our respondents to the survey determine that charter activity may be illegal? 27.5% of respondents said that they'd been informed by the client that there was an illegal charter. We weren't able to drill down in the survey as to how that actually came about, whether it was clients informing a Part 135 operator, legitimate operator, that they'd come across illegal charter activities, or it was simply, a client saying that they'd engaged in illegal charter. That was unclear. And but 27.5% said they'd been informed by the client. 15.7% said they'd been informed by flight crew. 17.6% noticed that there was multiple leases on a single aircraft, and that's a big red flag when it comes to illegal charters. That's something to really look out for, as it can sometimes indicate that there's something more nefarious going on. Another way that individuals determined that illegal charter activity was happening was through the nature of advertisements. I think it's safe to say that if something is being advertised and it sounds too good to be true, it normally is. So one of the red flags, again, that Gordon will talk about in the latter section of this presentation is looking at these types of advertisements, and they really are a red flag when it seems too good to be true. So the remaining questions that we had in our survey really focused on the regulators here in Asia Pacific and whether they were doing enough to combat illegal charter. I think the answer to this question was quite resounding from the AsBAA community. Over 90% felt that the regulators were not doing enough to combat illegal charter in this in the region. Again, I think there's many reasons for this. It's a lack of understanding, and we had another question on that. There's a lack of any enforcement mechanism for illegal charters, and just simply not enough checks that are being conducted. We know, for example, in Hong Kong, one of the things that they're doing is ramp checks, but these aren't really happening very often. They happen a few times a year, and it's not enough to really, catch the illegal charters that are happening. So more needs to be done, and I think it's an education and information and enhancing processes and procedures on the part of the regulator so that they start really treating this as a serious issue. And I think all of us who are, listening to the presentation today and who are involved in AsBAA really need to play a part in kind of starting this dialogue with the regulators and engaging them on this issue. And so on that point, a significant number of respondents felt that the regulator just simply didn't have a sufficient understanding of illegal charter. If you look at many of the websites for the regulators across the different jurisdictions from where AsBAA membership is drawn, you won't find a lot of information about illegal charter. If you contrast that to the FAA in the US and the CAA in the UK, you can find that information, and it is a topic that the regulators talk about. In APAC, I think it's safe to say that the regulators don't have a good enough understanding of this issue. So again, that comes down to education and the part that we all play in engaging regulators on this issue. And so looking at the regulators, we asked the question, are the penalties for illegal charter a sufficient deterrent in the APAC region? Nearly 75% said that the deterrents were not significant enough to deter illegal charter. If we again contrast the APAC position with the US, the FAA is very active in prosecuting breaches of aviation regulations, and it's been particularly active in the area of illegal charter. There is a reason for that. The FAA is structured very differently to many regulators in the APAC region, in the sense that it has an enforcement division contained within the FAA, which will prosecute cases. So there are a team of safety professionals and lawyers who form part of the FAA, and they will prosecute and enforce breaches of regulations. What we've seen in the US this year alone is some rather hefty fines being handed out. In April this year, an entity called BEL Aviation was fined $1.5 million for conducting illegal charter activities. Another entity in May 2020, an Atlanta charter operator, which engaged in over 200 flights, which were deemed to be illegal charters by the FAA, was fined nearly 5.89 million US dollars. Looking around regulatory enforcement actions in the APAC region, I was actually unable to find any significant examples of regulatory enforcement for illegal charter. So I think it's safe to say that in APAC, generally speaking, there isn't an enforcement regime that exists which acts as a significant deterrent to illegal charter. Illegal charter still goes on in places like the US, that's a given, but if you get caught, the ramifications, the fines and the criminal sanctions are significant. I think it's fair to say that in APAC, those don't yet exist, or if they do exist, they're not being enforced. And our final question in our survey was whether illegal charter is likely to get worse as a result of COVID-19. There's been a lot of talk throughout the two days of the Virtual Safety Summit as to the impact COVID-19 is going to have on the business aviation sector. I think in terms of illegal charter, it is going to make it worse, and that was certainly felt by the respondents to this survey, with nearly 80% saying that they felt that COVID-19 would make illegal charter worse and make it more common. I think there's a number of reasons for that. Obviously, the economic pressures created by COVID-19 is going to put pressures on the entire industry. When that starts to happen, people look to cut corners. They may not get the same licenses in place. They may not comply with the necessary operating requirements to maintain such licenses. There may also be examples of individuals who own assets, aviation assets, whether that's a helicopter or an aircraft, another type of aircraft. They will want to realize profit from those assets, and they may start using them for different purposes to what they used them for prior to the pandemic. So I think over the next months and year, COVID-19 is likely to increase the likelihood of illegal charters occurring, and that was certainly felt by AsBAA members. So those were our 12 questions from the survey. I hope that gave an interesting insight into the perception of illegal charter amongst the AsBAA membership. And the plan is for Gordon and I and AsBAA to share these survey results and to formally publish them in due course so that you can consider them in further detail. And obviously, if you have any questions about the survey, please do reach out to Gordon or I. So looking at some of the issues, looking at illegal charters and looking at the prevalence in the industry, why should industry stakeholders be worried? Well, I mean, it's very obvious from a charter customer, passenger perspective, why they should be worried. Safety. The Emiliano Sala case that we looked at, the number of different safety issues in that accident scenario, they were significant, and there were many of them. The problem here is, and if we look back to one of the previous sessions today, we looked at the Swiss cheese model when it comes to safety and safety oversight. Commercial operators, Part 135 license holders, there is a depth to their organization where before any flight can take place, there's been many layers of checks in relation to the flight planning, maintenance on the aircraft, pilot licensing requirements, pilot fatigue. All of these things are checked by many individuals within the organization across many different departments, meaning that flights are well organized, the aircraft is well maintained, and the individuals performing the flight have received the requisite training and are skilled, are well rested, all of those things. Quite often with illegal charters, those organizations which engage in illegal charter do not have that depth and experience. Quite often, you'll see many examples of entities where the individual is actually responsible for flight safety, for piloting the aircraft, for maintaining the aircraft, for arranging the catering, for arranging the flight plan. It's one person, it's the pilot. So there isn't that depth in the organization to prevent safety issues from occurring. And in the most extreme cases, accidents occur and lives are lost. Other factors which customers should be worried about include reputational issues and the transparency relating to who actually is the owner, operator, manager of the aircraft. And that actually became apparent in the Carlos Goshen case. where the contractual framework wasn't quite clear, and those that were engaging with each other and entering into contractual relationships hadn't done the correct due diligence to know what the aircraft was going to be used for and who they were engaging with. If you're a passenger or a user of a private aircraft and you engage in an illegal charter, you could be flying on an aircraft which is owned by a criminal entity, some other form of nefarious operation or business. And if it transpires that your aircraft is subsequently involved in an accident or an incident, or even if just the media or the press get hold of the fact that you were using an aircraft which belonged to a certain person, a less than reputable person, that can damage your reputation. There's also the risk that if the authorities find out that you yourself have been a passenger on an illegal charter or engaged in an illegal charter, that you may be investigated. Even if you're innocent, you didn't realize that you're engaging in an illegal charter. These investigation processes can sometimes last weeks, months, certain jurisdictions, many years. And you could be subject to an investigation for all of that period, which could create a significant amount of stress in your life. It will obviously, it's obviously not a nice process to be cross-examined, to be accused of something criminal, especially when you may be innocent. And finally, the point to note, not just for customers and for passengers, but also for operators, managers, and any other stakeholder, to be quite frank, is if you engage in a legal charter, there is a possibility that you'll invalidate your insurances. And so that's something to be mindful of, and often doesn't come to light that you've actually invalidated your insurance arrangements until after the event, when you're actually seeking to claim against your insurance and cover is denied. So what about owners, operators, and managers? Well, what should they worry about? I mean, as we've already mentioned, if you engage in a legal charter or people using your aircraft engage in a legal charter, you could be subject to prosecution. That could be fines, loss of licenses, imprisonment. All of these processes take a long time. In some jurisdictions, the wheels of justice don't spin very quickly. You could be engaged in legal cases for years. And that's obviously nothing, nobody wants to be involved in those types of processes. It's stressful, costly, and at the end of the day, it will cause a real damage to your reputation. It came out in the survey that one of the barriers to reporting was that it's a small community. If you start to get a reputation within that community, within the business aviation community, as being less than reputable, then that can obviously damage your business, both in the short term and the long term. Another thing to be mindful of as an owner, operator, or manager is what will actually happen to the underlying asset, to the aircraft, if there's any allegations that illegal charters have been engaged in. In some jurisdictions, the aviation authorities, the regulators, have the power to seize and confiscate aircraft while investigations are taking place. Gordon and I have both dealt with cases where, not necessarily illegal charter cases, but cases where aircraft have been seized while investigations have been ongoing or while regulatory actions have been taken. It can sometimes take years to get these aircraft back. It can also have the result of invalidating lease terms, finance provisions, which could also lead to the finance parties seeking repossession of the aircraft. If we look at some examples of situations where aircraft were seized by authorities, albeit in a very different context, if any of you remember the Kingfisher bankruptcy many years ago, some finance parties, some owners of aircraft were still not able to get that aircraft back out of India. 10 or so years, it took over a decade to get aircraft back. So the point I'm trying to make is that when aircraft are seized by authorities, it can sometimes take years and years to get the asset back. And not all jurisdictions, as you'll all know, have kind of the same protections that you might experience in jurisdictions like the US, the UK, Singapore, where there are, and Hong Kong, where there's robust legal systems. You might not get fair trial. You may not get heard fairly by the regulators, by the authorities. So there is a significant risk that by engaging in illegal charters, that may impact the rights that you have in the asset, and you may lose them. So I'm going to hand back over to Gordon. He's just going to look at how you might be able to spot illegal charters, and then looking at some practical questions that you might want to ask if you do notice them.
Thanks, James. I'm conscious of time, and I think we're just about over time. So what I'm going to do is skip the next section on illegal spotting illegal charters, because we've covered quite a lot of it. I'll go straight to the last slide, if I may, James, just to sort of wrap things up. So these are 5 specific points that we thought came out of the survey, which could be implemented as a way of trying to prevent illegal charter. I think it's naive to assume that illegal charter will disappear completely, but if these steps are taken, then there is a prospect of significantly reducing it. Firstly, there needs to be clear regulations. Secondly, there needs to be targeted education. That was something that came out of the European Business Aviation Associations very much pushed in the light of the Emilio Sana accident report. Thirdly, there needs to be coordinated regulatory action. I think I see one of the questions which has been asked is, how do we deal with our regulator? Well, I think it's not just a question of one regulator dealing with it. There has to be a sort of coordinated action. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a complete patchwork of regulatory activity across Asia, and I'm not sure that's going to be particularly effective. Fourthly, there have to be clear reporting procedures. It is very clear coming out of the survey that people just didn't know how to report illegal charter activity. So there has to be a clear mechanism for that. And lastly, there has to be tough enforcement and tough penalties, because without that, people, if the fine is not sufficient, then it pays somebody to operate illegally, pay a little bit of money, and to carry on doing it, because that's much cheaper than incurring the costs of getting an AOC and getting a 135 certificate. So those are the 5 suggestions that we have coming out of the survey and coming out of all of this activity. I'm sorry we've overrun slightly, but if we have time for any questions, happy to do that. Otherwise, our contact details are on the slide, and so James and I are very happy to deal with any questions offline. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon and James, for your illuminating presentation on such a sensitive topic. I do believe we have 2 questions, one in the chat box and one in the Q&A. James and Gordon, I believe you should be able to see both of them. Amro in the chat box has a question.
Yeah, so this one I think I've just dealt with. It's we've been trying our level best to assist the authority to go hard on illegal charters, but we find it challenging and sensitive. What approach do you suggest us to use? Soft approach, of course. I think, as I say, I think it needs to be, there needs to be some sort of coordinated regulatory activity. It's a question of persisting and raising the level of awareness of trying to combat illegal charter, because if you're just pushing yourself in one country and you are the only AOC in that country, then clearly that's going to be a bit of an uphill task. Whereas if all of the regulators in the region and all of the AOC operators in the region push together, then that's going to be a much more effective way of dealing with it.
Yeah, and I think on that point, Chris Barrow from HKBAC has said, does it make a difference, the kind of registration of the aircraft and how serious the regulators should treat that if most of the aircraft in there at the airport at any time are not, registered to that jurisdiction? I think as Gordon just touched upon there, it needs to be a coordinated approach across jurisdictions, so that notwithstanding the fact that an aircraft might not be registered to your jurisdiction, you are still looking out for evidence of illegal charters. Because it can impact passengers or the traveling public or an operator from any number of different jurisdictions, and accidents can happen anywhere. So it's the responsibility for all regulators to kind of club together and look at what could be done, I guess, across an APAC, across the entire APAC jurisdiction. But trying to get that level of cooperation is another challenge altogether.
Just on that point, I think one of the excuses, or one of the justifications, I should say, that was given by the Hong Kong regulator for not doing more ramp checks was because they were too busy doing SAFA checks. Well, if they're doing SAFA checks, then can they actually do ramp checks at the same time on illegal charter activity? I don't know. It's just throw that one out there, but it's a possibility.
I think another question here, Gordon, what happens to a pilot who just picks up the passenger but doesn't know the background of the passenger? Will he be charged? I think my comments there would be that, ignorance is no defense to illegality. We're involved in an industry where there's, a strong regulatory environment and individuals involved, whether you're a pilot or you're involved in the kind of ground handling or any other aspect of aviation, you're expected to know the regulations. So, questions should be asked. If you ask the relevant questions of passengers or whoever's using the aircraft, that may show that you've conducted your due diligence, but not knowing about the background of an individual that might be using an aircraft or the way that they may have paid for using the aircraft isn't necessarily a defense. Ignorance isn't a defense, and there is arguably an obligation to ask more questions if you have certain doubt.
Thank you, gentlemen. I believe we have time for one quick question, and then we'll have to wrap it up and move to the next session.
Just dealing with a couple of points that Mike has raised. Yeah, absolutely. I think this is, one of the reasons for doing the survey was so that AsBAA can use it as a tool to have discussions with local regulators, and it absolutely should be a platform for discussion with the local regulators. As to one of the other points which was raised, rich tycoons having significant influence in government regulators. Unfortunately, there's not much we can do about that, but it's this question, as I say, it's a question of, the rising tide. If all of the regulators take action across Asia, then hopefully that will diminish the influence that a rich tycoon has on one particular regulator, with the purpose of highlighting their lack of involvement. So I think the general consensus is there does need to be a concerted effort across the region between regulators rather than just by individual regulators.
Thank you, Gordon and James, for your valuable time and insight. For the remaining questions, we can coordinate with HFW and we can get back to everybody with an answer. Now, please don't go anywhere just yet. We've got our second to last session for day 2 coming right up. Thank you again, Gordon and James.